Okay, for the printmaking demonstration, we talked about doing the monotype, which is a print in which there's nothing really carved or developed by a mechanical means to leave an altered surface. So this is a real thin sheet of plastic, very flexible, that I'm going to use as the matrix to receive the print. Now, we're using watercolor. Now, we're going to do this a little differently than you'd expect. Because we're not using a printing press, we have to make sure that we have enough pigment on the plate so that it'll transfer to the image. So the way we're going to develop the image is by using the tube of paint directly onto the surface of the plate. And so I'm going to work with a really generalized image here of a landscape so that it can be quick. And in some cases I can simply use the tube itself to also distribute pigment. In addition to squeezing it out, I can also move the pigment around just by using the edge of the tube. I could also use a brush. You just want to be careful that you're not using the brush excessively to spread it out so thinly that it ceases to have or to leave enough surface texture on the plate. You can also do some mixing here. I'm going to take another tube of pigment, and this is really watered down, so I'm going to squeeze the excess out so that I can also utilize a little of this lighter hue in here. Okay, and then I'm even going to utilize some green. This will be a little strong, but once again I'm going to blend it right on the surface here. And I'm going to clean the tubes off by just using a paper towel so it doesn't dirty up that surface, so that when I squeeze it out, it'll give me a nice clean green. Okay, I'm going to switch to a different hue. Maybe suggest, whoops, this is that inexpensive paint that I was referring to in my talk the other day during a Zoom session, and I'm not sure if you were in on that. I don't believe you were able to make it, Maria, but I just simply made a comment about you get what you pay for. So if you don't spend very much money on your watercolor, you're spending very little money, then you're going to get very little in return for it. So I had a little bit of some very cheap watercolor that I showed, and one of the ways you can tell is by how much liquid came out of the tube before any pigment came out. So once again, I'm just going to do something really quick here and work in a more abstract theme here, so I can arrive at something quick. Although it's not quick, because what we have to do here is we're also going to rely on letting this set. It has to set up. We can't do any printing right now. This has got to take a minute to dry up, or actually 24 hours. You want to let this dry for 24 hours before printing it, And that should give you sufficient time to be able to pull a print from it. That way it won't be so gooey, which is all just going to squish down with the pressure that you need to apply. I'm just going to lighten this blue up a bit so it's not so intensely dark. Okay, so that. And I'm going to also switch up hues again and maybe come back with my I'm really going to take some time to clean off these tubes because it really left a dirty trace. I'm going to use some yellow again and come back down into the foreground here. And lay down some ground color back there. Let some of this mix up in there. Some of that green down in here. One of the comments I also made with regards to watercolor is that you know, also looking at the paper as being a part of your design, that you shouldn't work with the attitude, I want to cover up every square inch of this plate. It's just like in watercolor painting, the white of the paper is very important to leave it accessible in the design so that it just creates another area of interest to contrast the strong color. And of course we know the white of the paper is one of the reasons why watercolor is so dramatic in its appearance, is because the need for that surface. I'm going to come back to green here, and once again I'm going to maybe develop some stuff in the foreground here, some ground cover. I'm just squeezing a little out every now and then and scrubbing over it here, just so that I can also exploit a variety of marks here. Okay. Now I'm going to use the brush just a bit, mainly just to push around some of the pigment, so it doesn't always look quite so thick, and so that the marks that are left by the brush don't always appear so similar. I'm just going to change the stroke some. To get some variation. Just letting the brush do the work for you, just by poking and twirling the brush and pressing and pulling up, is to insinuate a variety of different kinds of surfaces that will read as ground cover and add for a more natural appearance. And over here I don't want to leave this gap of unpainted area, so I'm even going to indulge in a little of this yellow and pull some of it over out in this center part. Let that green mix with the yellow to have one other hue, but also to get rid, I don't want to have this aura of unpainted plate, so I want to add a little interest into some of those areas. And have a more complete composition and one that doesn't dissolve as it goes to the edges. Push this around. This is going to be real flimsy here wherever I'm pressing down with the brush. Create that. And I also think it might be important for me to bring a little blue down into the foreground. So I'm going to squeeze a little of it out on the tray. I don't want to put any of it down again with the actual. I just want to create some larger pockets to bring a little of that blue down into the composition. So it's primarily for a design choice. Is the reason why I want to move some of that green around, blue, from up above and bring it down below. So just so it balances the placement of color. Okay. And I've got a nice bright sky, but I think it might also be a good idea, talking about moving color, is to perhaps maybe bring a little of that heat from the yellow up above. Oh, that's a lot, so I'm going to have a lot to spread around here, so I'm going to bring some of this up. I'm also perhaps maybe going to introduce a little red in here. And I'm going to do a little more dabbling with the brush, because that's a whole lot of yellow in there that I need to move around and replace. I'm going to switch brushes because that brush has an awful lot of yellow in it. So I'm going to, or green, excuse me. I'm just going to pull some of this down, pull it up and into some of this area. I'm even going to allow it to mix a little with some of that red so that I can end up with some more color variation here. Bring this down, this area here. Okay. I'm going to keep a little of that light up above. Now it can be a little tricky because this plate is awfully flimsy and thin, and I'm holding it down with my fingers, but if you're uncomfortable doing that, or maybe you're a little worried about doing that, is you can always take a piece of tape and roll it up sticky side out and put it underneath so it stays in place while you're working. All right, so now I've got an image here. So what I want to do is let this dry. You're going to let this dry overnight for 24 hours, and then we're going to print it. And for that, we need a nice bond paper, but certainly not watercolor paper, because watercolor paper is just a little too thick, and we do need moisture in the paper, but not that much. All right. So we have to be cautious about using the right kind of paper. If it's too thin, like cheap drawing paper, the problem that you'll have there is that the paper will just cockle so much that it'll really irritate the presentation, and you're going to end up with a design or an image that's real hard to present because it's so wrinkled in it, so many wrinkles, and it gets difficult to handle. So what I'm going to use is a slightly heavier bond paper. It's usually it's going to feel like it's 3 or 4 sheets of paper, like 3 or 4 sheets of copy paper. You know, that's a good stock right there. It's not super thin. It's nowhere near as thick as watercolor paper, but that's what we're going to use. So we're going to let this dry overnight, and I'm going to come back tomorrow on the flip side, and we'll do some printing. One last thing I wanted to do before putting this away, let me see if it'll work. I also had some watercolor pencils, and I'm not sure if this plate is just too slick, but I did want to place a little of these, make some marks with this watercolor pencil. And you're hardly seeing anything now, but when the paper's moistened tomorrow, it'll loosen the dried watercolor, and then that's going to allow us to see a trace of some of these pencil marks. I'm just going to throw some of them in here just so that you can see what it'll look like. Plus, after we pull the print, we can also use a little of these pencils while we're waiting for the print to dry and work into the plate, work into the print, work a little color into the print. Work a little of this color around, and hopefully we'll be able to see this show up in the plate tomorrow. Alright, so we're going to let this dry, and the next video we're going to print, and then that'll give you an opportunity to begin to develop an image. Now the nice thing about using plexiglass, because it's transparent, of course you can always lay an image underneath. You can put something underneath that you want to use as a guide, and that way it will give you some kind of an organized composition to work from instead of inventing as you go along. So let's see what this looks like tomorrow when we'll print and get you on the flip side.